King Gideon was accustomed to the siren song of bloodshed, but it was a suffocating, silent weeping that pulled him to the kitchens at midnight. What he found there shattered everything he thought he knew. His trusted Beta's wolfless daughter huddled in the shadows, her bare back a marred tapestry of silver-burned agony. The crown of the northern reaches was forged in iron and blood, but it was sustained by loyalty. For King Gideon, that loyalty began and ended with his Beta, Cedric. They had bled together on the frozen fields of the Red Ridge. 15 years ago, when the southern rogues broke through their lines, Cedric had thrown his own body in front of a poisoned spear meant for Gideon. The man had nearly died, spending weeks in a fever dream, shivering on the brink of the afterlife. When Cedric finally opened his eyes, Gideon had knelt by his bedside, stripped off his own royal signet ring, and declared him Beta of the realm. Since that day, Cedric was known throughout the kingdom as the Paragon, a man of unwavering honor, fierce discipline, and absolute devotion to the crown. But Cedric carried a public tragedy. His beloved mate, Lady Beatrice, had died giving birth to their only child, Isolde. Isolde was the ghost of Æthelgard Castle. Now 21 years old, she was a striking contradiction to everything her father represented. Where Cedric was broad, boisterous, and commanded the attention of the Great Hall, Isolde was a fleeting shadow along the stone corridors. She had never shifted. In a medieval society of Lycans where the wolf was the soul's true reflection, to be wolfless was to be cursed. Cedric spoke of her with a heavy, sorrowful sigh, telling the High Lords that she possessed a fragile constitution, a weak heart, and a shattered mind. "She is my greatest heartbreak, my king," Cedric had told Gideon over ale just a week prior, his eyes misting with well-practiced grief. "I allow her to scrub the floors, to tend to the hearths with the common servants. The manual labor keeps her grounded. If she attends the royal balls, the noise and the scent of true wolves overwhelm her fragile senses." Gideon had sympathized with his old friend, but something about Isolde had always troubled the Alpha King's instincts. Whenever she crossed his path, her eyes were fixed firmly on the flagstones. She wore thick, high-collared wool dresses, even in the stifling heat of the harvest season, and her scent, which should have been a vibrant individual signature, was consistently muted, smelling faintly of cold ash, bitter roots, and sour metal. Gideon's inner wolf would pace restlessly whenever she was near, an inexplicable pull that he forced himself to ignore. After all, she was the defective daughter of his brother-in-arms. It was the night of the autumnal equinox. A grand feast raged in the great hall above. The castle was alive with the roaring laughter of warriors, the clinking of mead-filled goblets, and the heavy, intoxicating scent of roasted boar and spiced wine. Gideon had sat on his throne for hours, smiling through the political posturing, watching Cedric charm the visiting emissaries, but a profound, hollow exhaustion had settled over the king. Shortly before midnight, Gideon slipped away from the dais. He needed silence. The air in the hall was too thick, the pack dynamics too loud. He dismissed his royal guards with a wave of his hand, seeking the solitude of the castle's lower, forgotten levels. He walked down the spiraling stone staircases, the torches flickering and casting long, dancing shadows against the ancient walls. He intended to visit the armory, to ground himself in the familiar scent of oiled leather and steel. But as he passed the arched entrance to the subterranean kitchens, his enhanced senses caught something that made his boots halt on the cobblestones. It was a scent, copper and salt, blood and tears. Normally, the kitchens were empty at this hour, the servants having hauled the last of the feast up to the great hall, leaving the massive iron stoves to cool. The darkness was absolute, save for the dying, crimson embers of the main hearth. Gideon's wolf stirred, an aggressive, protective growl vibrating in his chest. He moved silently, his footfalls making no sound. He stepped into the cavernous room, his eyes instantly adjusting to the gloom. By the hearth, sitting on a low wooden milking stool, was a solitary figure. It was Isolde. She had her back to him. Her heavy woolen gown was pooled at her waist, her arms crossed over her chest as she clutched a damp, bloodied rag. Beside her sat a basin of murky water and a crushed poultice of herbs that smelled distinctly of wolfsbane, a highly toxic plant to their kind, used only to suppress shifts or numb agonizing pain. She was weeping. It wasn't a loud, dramatic cry. It was the sound of a soul that had been beaten into submission, a rhythmic, suffocated gasping, as if she were terrified that the very walls would hear her despair. Gideon took a step forward, intending to announce his presence, to ask the daughter of his best friend what ailed her, but as the dying light of the embers caught her exposed skin, the words died in the king's throat. His heart stopped. Her back was a canvas of butchery. Gideon stood frozen, the breath knocked from his lungs. Across Isolde's pale skin were scars of every age and severity. There were faded, raised white lines that crisscrossed her shoulder blades, the unmistakable work of a heavy leather whip. But it was the newer wounds that made the king's vision blur with a sudden, violent red haze. Deep, blistering burns marred her spine, the edges of the skin charred and weeping yellow fluid. They were perfect, geometric shapes, runes. They were burn marks left by searing hot silver, the only metal capable of hindering a werewolf's rapid healing. Whoever had done this had meticulously branded her, ensuring the wounds would scar permanently, ensuring the pain would linger for weeks. Who, Gideon's mind screamed, who within my heavily guarded walls could do this? A rogue? A sadistic guard? A low, involuntary snarl ripped through Gideon's chest. The sound echoed off the stone walls like a thunderclap. Isolde gasped, a sound of sheer, unadulterated terror. She dropped the bloody rag and scrambled backward off the stool, her bare spine hitting the rough stone wall of the hearth. She scrambled blindly for the bodice of her dress, trying to pull the heavy wool up to cover her shame. "No, please," she begged, her voice hoarse and broken. She squeezed her eyes shut, pulling her knees to her chest, trembling so violently her teeth chattered. "I scrubbed the floors. I swear it. I finished the chores. Please, do not use the silver tonight. I cannot take it. I cannot—" Isolde. Gideon's voice was a fractured rasp. At the sound of the king's voice, her eyes flew open. Wide, terrified pools of silver gray stared back at him. If possible, she paled even further, her breathing turning into sharp, panicked hyperventilation. "My king," she whimpered, pressing herself harder against the soot-stained stones, as if she could phase through the castle walls. "Forgive me. I did not mean to defile the kitchen. I am leaving. I will go." Gideon closed the distance between them in 2 massive strides. As he approached, he instinctively released a wave of calming, alpha pheromones, a scent of rain and deep woods meant to soothe frightened pack members. But to his shock, Isolde violently recoiled from the scent, covering her face with her arms as if expecting a blow. He stopped, dropping to his knees on the hard flagstones. The Alpha King, a man who bowed to no one, knelt in the ashes of the kitchen floor before his beta's daughter. "Isolde, look at me," Gideon commanded gently, keeping his voice as soft as velvet. She slowly lowered her arms, though she kept her gaze fixed firmly on his boots. "Who did this to you?" Gideon asked, his voice trembling with a terrifying contained rage. "Give me the name. Is it a guard? A lord from the court? Give me the name, Isolde, and I swear by the moon goddess his head will adorn a spike on the castle gates before dawn." Isolde let out a pathetic, hysterical laugh that turned into a sob. She shook her head rapidly. "You cannot. You would not believe me. No one would believe the defective girl." "I am your king," Gideon said fiercely, moving closer, his eyes scanning the agonizing silver burns on her shoulders. He reached out to gently touch her arm, but stopped himself. "It is my duty to protect every soul in this territory. You have my word. Who? You trust him with your life, my king," she whispered, a tear carving a clean line down her soot-stained cheek. "You eat at his table. You call him brother." Gideon's brow furrowed. His mind raced. "Lord Harlan? Maester Corvin? Speak his name," Gideon urged, leaning in. As he leaned closer, the heavy scent of her open wounds washed over him. The bitter smell of the wolfsbane poultice was fading. Beneath the metallic tang of fresh blood, Gideon inhaled deeply. His senses, honed by decades of warfare and tracking, isolated the residual scent left on her skin, the scent of the attacker. When a werewolf inflicts violence upon another, their sweat, their fury, their pheromones imprint on the victim. Gideon smelled crushed pine needles. He smelled iron and seasoned leather. He smelled the very same scent that he had stood beside on the battlefield. The scent of the man sitting at his right hand in the great hall, drinking his wine and kissing the rings of the high lords. Cedric. Gideon's heart ceased its rhythm. The air was sucked from the room. "No," Gideon breathed out, stumbling back a few inches on his knees. "No, Cedric. Your father?" Isolde squeezed her eyes shut, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her lashes. "He says it is to burn the weakness out," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper in the cavernous kitchen. "He says my wolf is asleep, lazy. He uses the silver to try and shock her awake. When she does not rise, he uses the whip to punish me for shaming his flawless reputation. The Paragon," Gideon whispered, the title tasting like bile on his tongue. "He tells everyone I am sickly," Isolde continued, shivering as the cold draft of the dungeon hit her bare, feverish skin. He keeps me in high collars. He forces me to drink wolfsbane so my scent is muffled, so no one can smell the infection of the silver burns. If I speak to anyone, if I look a lord in the eye, he drags me to the cellar. Gideon stared at her. The memories of the past 15 years flashed through his mind like lightning strikes. Cedric, volunteering to discipline rogue prisoners. Cedric's insistence that Isolde never be examined by the royal healers, claiming it upset her delicate nerves. Cedric placing a heavy, affectionate hand on Isolde's shoulder during a rare public appearance, and the way Isolde had gone rigid, her eyes deadening with sheer terror. Gideon hadn't seen a frail girl. He had seen a hostage. How long? Gideon asked, his voice devoid of emotion, though his hands were curled into fists so tight his claws were breaking the skin of his own palms. Since my 13th winter, Isolde whispered. Since the year I failed to shift. 8 years. For 8 years, the man Gideon trusted with the kingdom, the man who guarded the king's back, had been coming home and systematically torturing his own flesh and blood. Suddenly, the heavy oak door at the top of the kitchen stairs creaked open. Heavy, booted footsteps echoed down the spiral staircase, accompanied by a voice that was smooth, authoritative, and dripping with false concern. Isolde, Cedric's voice boomed down the corridor. Isolde, my sweet girl, are you down here? I noticed you weren't in your chambers. You know the dark is bad for your constitution. Isolde's entire body went rigid. The sheer, unadulterated horror that warped her features was a dagger to Gideon's chest. She looked at the king, her eyes pleading for a swift death over what was coming. Please, she mouthed silently, shrinking back into the darkest corner of the hearth. Please hide. If he finds you with me, he will kill me. He promised he would kill me. Gideon slowly rose to his feet. The weary king who had descended into the kitchens was gone. In his place stood the Alpha of the Northern Reaches, his eyes glowing a brilliant, terrifying amber in the dim light, his fangs elongated, scraping against his bottom lip. He will not touch you again, Gideon promised, his voice a lethal, vibrating growl that made the very stones of Aethelgard tremble. The footsteps grew louder, reaching the final landing. Isolde, answer your father, Cedric called out, stepping into the dim light of the kitchen. Gideon turned, stepping out of the shadows, placing his massive frame directly between the broken girl and the monster who broke her. She doesn't have to, the Alpha King rumbled, but you will answer to me. Cedric halted on the final stone step. The confident, booming aura of the paragon vanished, replaced by a rigid, chilling stillness. The flickering torchlight painted harsh, jagged shadows across his handsome, weathered face. For a fraction of a second, raw panic flashed in his eyes as he took in the scene. The bloody rags, the overturned basin of wolfsbane, and his liege, the Alpha King, standing as a lethal shield before his cowering daughter. Then, the mask slipped back into place. Cedric bowed his head, his voice dripping with smooth, practiced sorrow. My king, Cedric said, taking a cautious step forward, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. What a terrible sight for you to witness. I apologize that you had to see her in one of her episodes. The madness takes her, you see. She mutilates herself in the dark. I came down here to stop her. Isolde let out a broken, muffled whimper, pressing her face against her knees. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the king to believe the man the whole realm trusted. Gideon didn't move. His chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths. His amber eyes locked onto Cedric, tracking the microscopic twitches in the beta's jaw. She mutilates herself, Gideon repeated. The words were quiet, but they carried a dangerous, vibrating resonance that made the dust dance on the cobblestones. With pure silver branding irons, Cedric, cut in perfect geometric runes? On the center of her own back, where her own hands cannot reach? Cedric's throat bobbed. He took another step forward, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, the tone of a brother in arms sharing a heavy burden. Gideon, please. You do not understand the shame. She is wolfless. She killed my Beatrice. I bled for you. I took a spear for you on the Red Ridge, and the goddess rewarded me with a defective cripple who stains my legacy. I am trying to fix her. I am trying to shock the wolf awake. The king's nostrils flared. The admission hung in the air, a toxic cloud of justification and narcissism. Your legacy, Gideon rasped. I am the paragon of Ethelgard, Cedric snapped, his composure finally cracking, his voice rising in defensive fury. I govern your armies. I negotiate your treaties. Do not let the ravings of a broken girl undo 15 years of my loyalty. Step aside, my king. Let me discipline my kin. Cedric made the fatal mistake of stepping toward Isolde, his hand reaching for the heavy leather belt at his waist. Gideon moved faster than human eyes could track. There was a sickening crack as the Alpha King's fist connected with Cedric's jaw. The force of the blow lifted the massive Beta off his feet, sending him crashing backward into the heavy oak table in the center of the kitchen. The wood splintered with a deafening crash, sending iron pots and ceramic bowls shattering across the flagstones. Before Cedric could recover, Gideon was on him. The king's hand clamped around Cedric's throat, lifting the choking man pinned against the stone wall. Gideon's claws extended, piercing the skin of Cedric's neck, drawing thin rivers of blood. "Your debt was paid with the Beta ring," Gideon roared, his alpha aura exploding outward into the room, a suffocating, heavy pressure that forced the air from Cedric's lungs. "But tonight, Cedric, you pay for her." Gideon threw his head back and unleashed a deafening, chest-rattling roar. It was the call of the Alpha, a sound of pure war that echoed up the chimneys, reverberated through the floorboards, and shook the very foundations of Ethelgard Castle. Within seconds, the thunderous sound of armored boots flooded the stairwell. A dozen royal guards, led by the fiercely loyal Captain Thomas, burst into the kitchens with their swords drawn, expecting an assassination attempt. Instead, they froze in absolute shock. Their king had their revered Beta pinned to the wall, bleeding, and in the corner, shivering in a pool of her own blood and tears, was the Beta's daughter. "Sire," Captain Thomas gasped. "Strip him of his sigil," Gideon commanded, his voice cold and absolute. "Bind him in silver chains. Throw him in the black cells beneath the moat." "Gideon, you cannot do this!" Cedric choked out, thrashing against the king's iron grip. "The High Lords will riot. I am the Paragon." "You are a butcher," Gideon snarled softly in his ear. He ripped the heavy silver ring of the Beta from Cedric's finger, tossing it onto the blood-stained floor. "And you are no longer a wolf of this pack." Gideon released him, and the guards instantly swarmed the disgraced lord, dragging us screaming, cursing Cedric up the stairs and into the dark. The kitchens fell into a haunting silence, broken only by Isolde's ragged breathing. Gideon turned back to her. The adrenaline of the confrontation drained away, leaving only a profound, crushing sorrow. He approached her slowly, unfastening the heavy, fur-lined velvet cloak from his shoulders. He knelt, gently wrapping the warm cloak around her trembling, scarred body, being careful not to let the fabric drag across her fresh burns. Isolde looked up at him, her silver-gray eyes wide with disbelief. "He's gone," Gideon whispered, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. She was terrifyingly light. "You are safe, Isolde. I swear it on my life." Isolde rested her cheek against the solid armor of his chest, the final remnants of her strength giving way, and slipped into the merciful blackness of unconsciousness. The political fallout was instantaneous and explosive. When morning broke over Ethelgard, the castle was in an uproar. The High Lords of the Northern Reaches, led by the influential Lord Reginald Blackwood, demanded an audience. They could not fathom why their beloved Paragon had been thrown into the darkest dungeon of the realm. Whispers of the king's madness began to circulate through the great hall. Gideon did not entertain their murmurs. He summoned the entire council to the throne room, ordering Cedric dragged before them in chains. "You demand an explanation for the fall of the Paragon," Gideon addressed the murmuring lords from his throne. "Behold his legacy." Gideon gestured to Captain Thomas, who dumped a heavy burlap sack onto the marble floor. Out spilled the horrors Cedric had kept hidden in his private chambers. Heavy iron scourges coated in dried blood, vials of concentrated wolfsbane, and the undeniable, damning evidence pure silver branding irons, custom forged in the exact geometric shapes found on Isolde's back. The throne room fell deathly silent. Lord Blackwood paled, stepping back from the cruel instruments in disgust. The honor of a werewolf was sacred. To torture one's own flesh and blood, to use silver against a pack member, was an abomination against the moon goddess. He poisoned his own daughter for 8 years, Gideon's voice echoed through the horrified silence. He suppressed her mind and mutilated her body to maintain the illusion of his own perfection. The penalty for high treason against a pack member is exile to the Deadlands. Cedric, stripped of his fine silks and bruised, looked up with eyes full of venom. "She is a curse. You will see, Gideon. When the madness takes her, you will regret casting me out." "Take him away," Gideon commanded, turning his back on his former brother-in-arms forever. While the kingdom dealt with the shock of Cedric's betrayal, a much quieter battle was being waged in the king's private chambers. Gideon had refused to let Isolde be taken to the healer's wing. Instead, she lay in the center of his massive, fur-draped bed, Maester Arthur, the king's most trusted physician, worked tirelessly for 3 days and 3 nights, carefully treating the severe burns and managing the agonizing withdrawal symptoms as 8 years' worth of wolfsbane finally began to leave Isolde's system. Isolde suffered severe fevers, thrashing in the sheets as the toxic herb was purged from her blood. Gideon never left her side. He held her hands when she screamed in her delirium, murmuring soft words of comfort, bathing her face with cool water. On the night of the 4th day, the full moon hung high in the sky, casting brilliant shafts of silver light through the tall, stained glass windows of the king's chambers. Gideon was sitting in a heavy oak chair beside the bed, exhausted, reading a leather-bound ledger by candlelight. Suddenly, the air in the room shifted. The sour, metallic scent of cold ash and bitter roots, the scent Isolde had carried her entire life, was gone. In its place, a new fragrance bloomed, hitting Gideon's enhanced senses like a physical blow. It was the scent of night-blooming jasmine, crushed pine, and sweet honey, interlaced with the sharp electric tang of ozone before a thunderstorm. It was the most intoxicating, perfect scent Gideon had ever encountered. His inner wolf, usually a disciplined, stoic beast, threw its head back and howled within his mind. Mine. Gideon dropped the ledger. He stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs, staring at the bed. The suppression of the wolfsbane hadn't just hidden her burns. It had masked her true scent. It had masked the mate bond. Isolde stirred. Her long, dark lashes fluttered open, and for the first time her silver-gray eyes were clear, lucid, and devoid of the hazy dullness the poison had forced upon her. She looked around the opulent room, then her gaze settled on the king. "You're here," she whispered, her voice rough but steady. "I am here," Gideon replied softly, approaching the edge of the bed. "The fever has broken. How do you feel?" Isolde pushed herself up onto her elbows. To her shock, the agonizing stretch of her ruined skin was gone. She reached a hand over her shoulder, touching her back. The burns were healed, leaving only smooth, silvery scars. Without the wolfsbane suppressing her immune system, her werewolf healing had finally accelerated. "He's gone," she breathed, the realization finally settling into her bones. "I am safe. He will never cast a shadow in this kingdom again," Gideon vowed. He hesitated, then spoke the truth that was currently vibrating through his very soul. "Isolde, the wolfsbane. It hid more than your pain. It hid you." Isolde frowned, confused, until she took a deep breath. Her eyes widened as the heavy, rich scent of the king rain and deep woods washed over her, no longer terrifying, but profoundly comforting, pulling at her chest with an invisible, unbreakable tether. "Mate," she gasped, her hands trembling. "Yes," Gideon said softly, "but Cedric knew. He recognized what you were to me years ago. He knew that if you claimed your place at my side, he would lose his absolute control. He tortured you to keep you weak, to keep you hidden from me." Tears welled in Isolde's eyes, but this time, they were not tears of despair. They were tears of a caged bird seeing the open sky for the first time. "I thought I was broken. I thought my wolf was dead." "She was never dead," Gideon said, extending his hand to her. "She was just waiting for the poison to clear. She was waiting to be safe." As she placed her small hand in his, a sudden, powerful tremor racked her body. The moonlight streaming through the window seemed to bend, drawn toward her. Her bones began to pop and elongate, not with the agonizing snap of a forced shift, but with the fluid, powerful grace of a dam finally breaking. Gideon stepped back in awe. Right before his eyes, the frail, wolfless ghost of Aethelgard transformed. Where the scarred girl had been, a magnificent beast now stood. She was breathtaking. A massive, pure silver wolf, larger than any female in the territory. Her coat shimmering like starlight, her silver-gray eyes burning with ancient, untamed intelligence. She was no defective cripple. She was a true Luna. The silver wolf stepped off the bed, shaking out her magnificent coat. She approached Gideon, pressing her large, warm forehead against his chest. Gideon buried his hands in her thick fur, burying his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of his fated mate. The paragon had tried to burn the weakness out of her, but he had only succeeded in forging a queen made of unbreakable steel. Scars do not dictate your worth. They are merely the battlegrounds where your survival was forged. Isolde emerged from the ashes of her abuse not as a broken girl, but as the Silver Queen of Aethelgard. Her story reminds us that true strength often slumbers beneath our deepest wounds, waiting for the poison to clear. In the end, the fiercest wolves are born from the darkest nights.